So good evening and welcome to Climate Impacts. My name is Megan Zimmerman and I'm a librarian with the Alexandria Library. That being said, I do want to put in a disclaimer. What I have done is try to combine a lot of the information that we've been gathering over the past year to give you an idea of what we will be expecting in this area. And this event is part of Climate Prep Week. Which happens September 24th through the 30th. And it was started by CREW, which is Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. And this is a week they have set aside for learning, service, and actions to better prepare our communities for extreme weather events. CREW is a nonprofit that's located in Boston, Massachusetts, and their philosophy is climate change impacts us all. So we want to be able to prepare for climate change in ways that will best serve ourselves and our communities. They believe that if we start preparing and planning from the ground up, engaging everyone and coordinating across neighborhoods, we can have a real impact that is both large scale and locally meaningful. And the foundation of this workshop or webinar this evening comes from CREW. So Alexandria Library became a climate resilience hub last year, and this was a partnership through CREW and the American Library Association. We had a series of events last year that we partnered with the Transportation and Environmental Services to host. And climate resilience hubs are community institutions that help their communities prepare for and respond to extreme weather events. And it's a growing network. There's more than 65 hubs currently in the US and in Canada. And our Climate Resilience Hub is located at the Kate Waller Barrett branch in Old Town. While all of the branches in the library system serve as cooling stations in extreme heat during open hours, the Barrett Library also contains a Resilient Communities collection, which contains information about local resources from the city, upcoming sustainability and climate change events, and then there's a good-sized collection of books and DVDs that speak specifically to sustainability, resiliency, and the climate crisis. So this summer really seems to awaken a lot of people to the reality of the climate crisis. We had lots of things happening, not only in the US, but around the world. There was an article that came out earlier this month in the Washington Post that headline was, "Almost 1 in 3 Americans have experienced a weather disaster in this summer alone." In addition to that, 64% of people living in the United States experienced a multi-day heat wave. And unfortunately, 338 people have died due to hurricanes, floods, heat waves, and wildfires since June of this year, just in the US. And this is not even looking at what's happening worldwide in Afghanistan and Greece and Haiti and other places. And when we're talking about climate prep and climate change preparation, not everyone is affected by these climate changes equally. These points listed here come from the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, which is through the Climate Program Office of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and was just published in March of this year. So as you can see, climate change tends to exacerbate already pre-existing inequalities. So when we're discussing how to prepare, we also need to keep in mind that climate change prep is an environmental issue, environmental justice issue. And I also want to apologize up front. So this is not going to be the funnest first part that we're going to walk through. We've done a lot of programs on sustainability and things that you can do to reduce the effects of climate change and how we can live more sustainability. This is not one of those programs. This is more a focus of what the science is saying we will be seeing and what we can do to respond to these realities, these changing realities. So I want to thank you for being here. It could not be the most fun thing to think about, but it shows that you are really thinking about the future and what is important. So the rest of the time that we are going to be focusing on is looking at climate change and specifically how it's going to manifest in Northern Virginia. And then we're going to talk about preparation, both for the long term, and then also touch on what you can do in emergency situations. So many of you, well, probably all of you know what climate change is. Does anyone want to take a stab at explaining it quickly for us? And I will go ahead, you can either put it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and do that as well. You should have got a message saying that you can unmute yourself if you like. Okay, if you don't want to as well, that is absolutely fine. But I am going to go ahead and mute everyone again. So I was in a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and I really enjoyed the descriptions that the presenter shared. Oh, and Ellen wrote, climate change is the impact of human activity affecting the global climate. Exactly. In the webinar, the presenter, she shared very concise what I thought was a great explanation of what the difference between weather and climate in the environment. So weather being what is happening today, climate is the patterns of conditions over decades and centuries, the environment is what you feel around you, and the climate is what the planet feels. And climate change shows itself by driving more extreme storms and heat and drought, and changing the environment in ways that is becoming dangerous for our way of life and other living beings. For the world as a whole, it used to be that climate was relatively consistent. Any significant changes were happening over thousands of years. But recently, as Ellen just mentioned, human activities have caused the climate to change at a much faster rate. Specifically, the world is heating up, and this is causing a lot of changes to the weather patterns, which we will talk about. So why is our climate changing? In a 2-cent explanation, sunlight that hits the earth bounces back up towards space, but there are gases in the atmosphere that reflect that escaping light to allow heat to stay on earth. And this is what has allowed support to exist on earth. Otherwise the planet would be as barren as the moon. But in the last couple of years, this has changed a lot as we've been adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide and methane. And so the planet is heating up more rapidly. And the main cause of this is that we want energy, and we burn coal and oil and gas, which release these gases into the environment. And it's like adding blankets onto the planet, which traps in that heat. So what does this theory of climate change look like for us who are in Northern Virginia? The Southeast region, which includes Virginia, is developing at a faster rate than the rest of the country. And this is predicted to continue throughout the rest of the century as businesses and tech companies find roots here. This will increase the amount of impervious area or land that cannot absorb precipitation because it's now covered in concrete or asphalt. It will increase the number of people living in the region, increase the urban heat islands, and decrease the amount of forest and farmland due to conversion of that land into developed urban areas. So one of the first big impacts that we should be preparing for is an increase in the number of very hot summer days and summer temperature in general. This sounds like a not so bad idea on the surface, but in reality, in the developed world, heat kills more people than hurricanes, floods, extreme cold, and drought. So it can be very serious and very difficult for our systems to handle these extreme heat temperatures. This is a historical graph of the average temperatures across the Southeast since 1920. And you can see since the 1980s, there has been a trend that's continued upward. And this is expected to continue in this upward trajectory. And this is a closer look at our specific region. These are two maps showing the DMV. On the left is a historic map that shows the number of days over 90 degrees between 1961 through 1990. And the map on the right shows the predicted number of days over 90 degrees until the year 2050. This map system actually defaults to 2100, but I chose to shrink it down to 2050 for two reasons. One, 2100 can seem very far away, and two, we keep hearing that 2050 is this year that things will have very big impacts. So I thought this would be a more relevant time to stop this map. So what we're looking at, this is the high emissions version of this area. And what that means is if we do not curb our emissions into the atmosphere, we can expect to have 73 days a year that are over 90 degrees. But even at lower emissions, which means we meet the mark and we're not sending more gases into the atmosphere or an acceptable amount, we would still have 62.5 days out of the year would be over 90 degrees. And just for perspective, that map on the left reflects that historically Alexandria experienced about 25.3 days a year over 90, which is high, but 62 is even more than double that number. Another concern is the increasing minimum temperature. Typically at nighttime, when the earth, people and other living things get some relief from the heat of the day. But as you can see from this map, Northern Virginia has seen a large rise in that minimum temperature. The darker the color, the more days that we're seeing an increased minimum temperature. And this is even more so than much of the rest of the Southeast region. And another term you probably heard and are familiar with is urban heat islands. This refers to the fact that cities and urban areas have significantly higher concentrations of concrete, brick, and asphalt than rural areas. And these stone structures absorb heat during the day and then release it as the outside air cools, resulting in areas that are 3 to 5 degrees hotter during the day and up to 10 degrees hotter during the night. And since cities have fewer trees, which provide shade and cooling through photosynthesis, and the heat is also being created by the number of cars that are putting out exhaust and air conditioners that are pumping hot air from the inside to the outside, there's lots of things that are contributing to this hotter city experience. And low-income areas often suffer the most as they have even less green space than the rest of the cities and have fewer resources to adapt. So these extreme heats have effects on many assets. They can cause damage to the infrastructure. And this is not only inconvenient, it also means that more tax dollars are being put into the repairs. And the more heat we have means more repairs are going to be necessary. And extreme heat also affects people's internal temperature, which can cause dehydration and puts pressure on our heart and respiratory systems. And unfortunately, higher heat temperatures result in more heat waves, so it kind of is a cycle that causes one to another. Another impact that we're going to see in Northern Virginia is an increase in the biggest storms. Oh, and Ellen shared that the NVRC has a recent heat island map of the region where you can close in on a block of areas in the city of Alexandria. So you can see down to your neighborhood, it sounds like what that heat looks like for you. So as we're seeing more rain, we're also seeing an increase in the biggest storms. And this is due to the heat. As air becomes warmer, it holds more moisture. So when it does rain, those events are stronger. In the last 50 years, we've seen the amount of water that drops in the very strongest storms go up by 27%. And a closer look at the Southeast region, you can see in that lower graph on the bottom left there, there's been a steady increase in the amount of rain, especially in the last 3 decades. And then these maps that we're looking at in the center here are compared to the slide we just looked at. These show the precipitation on the left is the percentage of rainfall from 1986 to 2015. And on the right, that is what is anticipated precipitation in the years 27 to 2099. And you can see all Virginia is quite in the dark blue. So looking at upwards of 40% increase in heavy rainfall. So just like with heat, rain has its effects on us and the environment. And one of those major effects is floods. And this excess water can cause damage to sewage and transportation systems. The global cost of flood damage is currently at $96 billion, and it's expected to quintuple by 2030. That's in less than a decade. It will go up by that much. Floods cause runoff, which is when precipitation travels across surfaces as water. And when this happens, it can overwhelm storm systems and cause sewers to overflow. In cities, particularly those with older systems, of which Alexandria is one, this means raw sewage can leak into rivers and streams, posing serious health issues. FEMA expects that floodplains will grow by 45% and that coastal floodplains will grow by 55% by the year 2100. And this is actually not just due to increased rain. We are kind of doing it to ourselves. We are creating dangerous areas and then we move into them. So as we, again, cut down trees and clear land for roads, we are increasing our exposure to flooding. So this is a map from Flood Factor. There's actually a number of maps that are out there that you can look at. But this one is showing where flooding can occur in Alexandria. And so you see the darker the color, the more extreme the flooding is expected. And in this particular model by the First Street Foundation nonprofit uses high intensity rainfall, overflowing rivers and streams, high tides and coastal storm surges to assess what they think the potential for flooding is. So it's not just us that will be affected by these changes. There will also be ecological impacts. Trees and plants may not be able to adapt to the increasing temperatures and will migrate north. The soil also may become too salty, especially on the coast, as saltwater intrudes on those forests and tree areas. We'll see a loss of tidal marshes where there's a great diversity of birds and mollusks, fish and turtles and crabs. And also these climate changes may impact bird migration patterns, who they may not feel the need to travel as far south, which would affect our pollination and pest control. And it can also potentially exacerbate the expansion of invasive species. Our native plants can be fragile, and these more adaptive species can push out our native plants. And these are pictures of three endangered species in the Virginia area. So there also will be agricultural and economic stresses. So even though we are getting these deluges of rain, there are also greater periods of drought, which may cause the need for irrigation, which is expensive, and it also impacts our water supply. And then when it does have these severe storms, it can cause soil erosion as well as drown the plants. Farms, just like the forests and trees along the coast, risk intrusion of salt water onto the lands. And warming temperatures mean more freeze-free days. And this cold weather is important because it helps to keep insect populations in check. So if it doesn't freeze, crop damaging insects are allowed to proliferate. And extreme heat, just like it affects our bodies, affects farm animals as well. So farms may need to implement cooling systems for livestock or risk reduction of their inventory. And then warming temperatures and rising waters are also changing the habitats of many of the fish and mollusks that we eat. There are also economic stresses. The cost to mitigate climate change, along with the cost of cleanup and recovery after a disaster, is only expected to increase. Beaches are eroding, and as the animal migration patterns change, this will affect how tourism works. And then construction and agricultural workers and others who work outside will not be able to work in these dangerous temperatures or if there's an extreme weather. If emissions continue to increase, the region could lose up to 1/3 of its outdoor productivity from heat-related impacts by the 2090s. And some of the most vulnerable sectors to heat-related deaths include laborers, construction and support, waste, remediation services, which are highly concentrated in urban areas. And if you're interested in looking at those urban heat maps, Ellen has graciously put that in the chat. All right, so there also will be health impacts to us. One thing that's starting to gain attention is the mental stress that climate change is causing. 50% of Hurricane Katrina survivors developed anxiety or depression, even as early as 2003, people who lived through the wildfires, 1/4 of them developed PTSD. And then there's a consideration for pre-traumatic stress, and this is anticipating all of these things that are impending in our future. It's estimated that 40% of the population feels helpless about what they can do about climate change. Our air quality will continue to be threatened by ozone and particulate matter that's coming from construction and vehicle exhaust, along with other natural causes. This statement from the National Climate Assessment about the Southeast region says, climate change is expected to worsen existing health conditions and introduce a new health threats by increasing the frequency and intensity of poor air quality days, extreme high temperature events, and heavy rainfalls, extending pollen seasons, and modifying the distribution of disease-carrying pests and insects. By the mid-century, the region is projected to experience substantial yet avoidable loss of life, worsened health conditions, and economic impacts estimated in the billions of dollars, and as a result of these changes. And last but not least are the social impacts. As lands flood, desertification continues, crops fail, hurricanes and severe storms destroy property and communities, societies will be disrupted. People living in coastal areas will have to move inland. People living in areas where food can no longer be grown will have to leave their homelands, and political turmoil will only exacerbate these issues. I was reading in Afghanistan, there are millions of people facing starvation because of the drought that's been going on, and then combined with the instability of their government, it's a pretty dire situation. And then we can look to our southern border for the Haitian refugees who have been seeking shelter and security after their summer storms and political upheaval. It's expected by the year 2050, the number of climate refugees will have increased to 1 billion people. So author David Pogge writes, the greenhouse effect has already pumped enough new heat into the oceans to keep warming the planet for decades. The world has changed and it will keep changing for the rest of your life. It's time to prepare. So that's what we're going to do, is talk about what we can do to prepare for climate change. So there are things that you must do ahead of time to prepare for potential disasters. Taking the time now to assess what you and your home need can end up saving your time and yourself when it's most important. So we'll touch on each of these areas on the list: home and garden, preparing your children, going outside, the emergency plan, and the go bag, a little more detail. So the first thing I want to mention, as we talked about the mental stress of climate change, is this is having an impact on us, and especially if you've already lived through a disaster or experienced some extreme situations. Oh, thank you. And then going back to the discussion, is one thing we can do is plant more trees and shrubs to reduce the heat islands and also absorb carbon. And then Ashley shares, oh, and I'm sorry, Ashley, I would love to have you speak, but the feature doesn't seem to be letting me do that, so I apologize. But as you're preparing yourself mentally, if you feel like you're being this is too much for you, there are actually growing areas in the world of therapy that are focusing specifically on climate anxiety. So there's ways to get help. And I do encourage that because that will help you in the long run if you're able to focus on what is ahead in a way that's not overwhelming. So one thing to think about is, where are you going to live? This is going to be something that people will be thinking about in the coming few years and decades, whether to stay where you are or to move somewhere that will not be as hit as where they currently are. We know that coasts are flooding and are losing land. Properties will continue to be damaged by storms and severe weather. Everywhere is getting hotter, but some areas are affected more than others. A typical North American city has the potential to feel as if it's moved 250 miles south. Drought is continuing to be problematic in certain portions of the country, and this will affect drinking water supply, crops, and energy production. And as we talked about, pest-borne illnesses, as ticks and mosquitoes grow in territory, will be a problem. I've seen it recommended if you want to get away from as many of these inhospitable climates as possible, to move above the 42nd parallel line. However, in the US, that's not very much area. There's only about 16 states that are above that line. So if you're thinking about moving, you want to do that soon, as more and more people are scrambling to get to these spaces. But if you are not planning to move, if you want to stay in Northern Virginia area, it will do you good to adapt your home to stave off the worst of what is coming. And the nice thing is, a lot of prepping your home for environmental damage also has a lot of sustainability benefits. So one of the first areas you want to think about when doing home improvements is where your energy will come from. Getting a generator is an option, and depending on what you're planning to power will depend on the size and strength of the kind of generator that you get. If you just want it to be able to power your phones, to make sure you can keep track of what's happening in the world as the disaster is waning, and know what the authorities are suggesting. You may not need a large generator. However, if you're wanting your whole house to run as it normally would, then you're probably going to need a much larger size. Another option is to install solar panels. The cost for solar panels has gone down, and related to, there's lots of benefits to solar panels, but related to our conversation, when the grid goes down, you will still have power. So that's an added bonus to installing solar on your home. The other thing you really want to think about is where your water will come from. You can purchase bottled water, but this becomes expensive quickly, and it's also terrible for the environment. There are other options. You can install backup water tanks as an inline water tank in your home, and you also can install rain catchments or rain barrels. This is not water that you can drink directly. You may want to save this water for non-consumption uses, but you could also get a purification system such as reverse osmosis that may be able to filter that water to the level where you could drink it. Another thought that you want to think about is the air quality in your home. As we saw, as the fires burning on the West Coast seemed thousands of miles away, yet they still impacted our air quality here. The accordion filters that you put on your HVAC systems, if you have those, are a good way to filter, and they have a rating system on those from 1 to 16, and typically the higher the number of the rating, the higher the filtration. It can get pretty dense, which makes it a little bit maybe not work as well as some of the fewer numbers, lower numbers. But there's also portable room purifiers that you can get, and these come in various levels. There's active carbon room purifiers that will eliminate smoke and smells. And then there's HEPA room purifiers that can remove a little more such as particulate matter that's larger than 2 microns. And then you can also install filters for the entire home. As we talked about, heat is going to be a major issue in this region. So you want to think about your windows, those areas where sunlight comes into your home. And for many people, that is your east and west windows. In those areas, you may want to consider installing, if you're replacing windows, low heat gain rating windows, or use shades or awnings during the high heat time of the day. Another thing I hadn't heard about before, but is kind of interesting, is consideration of installing a white roof. Dark roofs can be 90% hotter than the air around them. You can also just paint a reflective coating on the roof, and this can save your electric bill in relation to cooling up to 40%. And then you can also, as Ellen mentioned, you can plant trees and shrubs and also install awnings to help with shading. And you can also insulate your walls and roofs, and then also check your house for air leaks. As Ellen has mentioned many times, that it does no good to insulate your home if you're leaking air through the leaks in your home. And I'll just share some of the things that have been posted. And Ellen mentions generators are not environmentally friendly. This is true. They often run on gasoline. And then Elizabeth mentioned Solarize program told me that solar panels aren't allowed to operate when the power's out. And then Ellen responds to that, I believe, that solar panels can be switched out of the grid with the correct controls, but most often a battery backup is used for when the power is out. And also another idea for your roof is to use lighter colored tiles. And then for those of you in Alexandria, you know that flooding is a major concern. And so you want to consider flood-proofing your home. One thing you can do is, if you have area that does flood frequently, is use FEMA approved or FEMA acceptable flood resistant materials. You want to protect your electric panels and HVAC, and you can do that either by raising those appliances above the flood zone, or building a wall around the appliances to prevent high enough to where the water may rise. You can install, and this is frequently suggested by the city, is to install a backflow preventer. And you can also get basement plugs for drains and standpipes. Another option is to install floodgates and flood panels to protect the exterior of your home. Or to protect the structure of your home. And extreme, if you're absolutely tired of dealing with flooding, is to consider maybe raising your house or the floors above, at least the first floor above flooding, if you're able to do that. FEMA offers a flood mitigation assistant grant, and this is for people with national flood insurance policies, and to encourage you to make these kinds of improvements to your home. And then less expensive ideas are to keep gutters and downspouts clear, seal cracks in the basement with waterproofing compound, get a waterproof storage box for important papers and documents. And then you may also want to install a indoor water alarm system so that in the night time or other times that you may not be home, you can be alerted to when the home is flooding. The Flood Action Alexandria has a approved list of flood mitigation practices that show you some more ideas of what you can do to protect your home and make home improvements. And they give you what you can do, and also what you can, and what level, if you need to get city approval before you make these changes, or if there's something you can do all on your own. So I will share that with you all after the program so that you can access that as well. So another thing you want to think about is maybe growing a survival garden. As drought continues, as food systems are impacted, we could see prices soaring, or it may be difficult to get certain foods. So you may want to consider what you can grow at home. What I consulted recommended growing things that will last a while, so such as peanuts that can keep a year in their shell after being harvested. Beans can be dried and then reused later. Green beans and tomatoes are great for jarring, and then root vegetables and squash can last quite a while without refrigeration. If you have a yard that floods a lot, you may consider putting in a raised bed. But if you live in a condo or apartment, you can also grow these vegetables in pots. There's no reason you can't, just make sure there's good drainage. If you don't have enough light, at least 6 hours, you can get a grow light to help your plants grow. It's recommended that you consider growing a variety of plants of the same kind. Just as climate is changing, it's going to affect when the plants will start to grow earlier, but that doesn't necessarily mean that pollinators are popping up at the same time as the plants are. So growing a variety of foods will help you collect as many pollinators as you can get. And then also think about those hardiness zones. As our climate is changing, crops that may not have grown here before may be able to grow as well. Another thing you want to think about is preparing your children. Children feel about the climate change as parents and grandparents felt about the Cold War. It's sort of this impending unknown thing that's hanging over our heads. So it's important to talk to them about what is happening. It can be your kids, your grandkids. But before you do, make sure what you're talking to them about is age appropriate and that you've done your research. Don't want to make the situation worse. And definitely avoid using shock. Really try and stick to the facts and propose actions that you can do as a family so that you feel like there's things that you can do. And then when you're making your preparations, let them help. It will give them a sense of control and it can make them feel more prepared as well. And then Ellen mentioned if you are considering flood-proofing your home, there's a program through the city of Alexandria that will be coming that you can get a rebate up to $5,000. And then gardening also reduces food waste because you can just harvest what you want each day and the plant will plant the variety of plants that you want. So another thing we have to think about is our recreation outside. So as we mentioned, heat is going to be significant in this area. So it's important to know what some of the stresses look like from heat. So heat cramps happen at the point when you've lost enough salt and water to cause muscle spasms. Heat exhaustion is when you've been exposed to extreme heat for a couple of days. A person might show heavy sweating and a racing heart, feel faint and dizzy and tired. And a heat stroke is when the internal temperature spikes to 104 degrees. Person may seem confused and dizzy with a terrible headache, and they're no longer sweating. Their skin is actually hot and dry to the touch. If you are in the presence of someone experiencing that while you're waiting for professional help to arrive, you can assist them by helping them get as cool as possible. You want to move them to a shade or indoors where there's air conditioning, help them remove layers, spray them with water or apply cold compresses, anything to get that temperature down and them rehydrated. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, insects are growing in proliferation and numbers and where they reside. So this is actually a map of the Aedes aegypti and its area of habitat that is expanding. So mosquitoes can spread a number of viruses. We've been pretty lucky so far that it hasn't been too severe in the United States. That could change over the coming years. So what you want to do as much as possible is prevent your experience with mosquitoes as you can. So if on your property, you can drain standing water because they just need just a little bit of still water to reproduce in. You can use a spray, a chemical spray by a professional company. you should know this will also affect the helpful insects in your area. And I did learn earlier this summer that if you spray and then it rains very hard after that, it's just going to wash away all of the spray. So a better way to handle mosquitoes is to prepare your physical self. So one idea is to avoid dusk to dawn. That will help you. It won't help you with the Asian tiger mosquito, but it will help with the Aedes aegypti. When you go outside, wear long pants and long sleeves in light colors. And then you want to wear insect repellent with DEET or picaridin in it. You can treat your clothes with permethrin, and that will actually kill the mosquitoes. Another pest or insect that is kind of a danger to us is our ticks. So we're all sort of familiar with Lyme disease, but ticks can carry up to 16 other diseases as well. All of them do not sound pleasant. It's estimated that 300,000 people a year are infected with Lyme disease, and 95% of those cases occur within 14 states, of which Virginia is one of those. So the best way to deal with ticks is on your property, clear tall grasses and brush away from walkways or areas that you may walk against or brush against. And again, just like with mosquitoes, the best way to protect yourself is to prepare yourself wearing long sleeve shirts and long pants, tucking your pants into your socks so mosquito or ticks don't climb up your legs. And then again, using DEET insect repellent or the picaridin to prevent or repel them from you. It's also possible for your pets to get Lyme disease. So you want to make sure you're checking your pets when they go outside. You can also use repellents in a variety of ways on them. And the good news is, although there's not a vaccine for humans, there is a Lyme disease vaccine for dogs. So you may want to think about that, especially if you're outdoors, enjoy going outside. Let's see. And Elaine shares with us, there's an excellent series of articles about dealing with ticks and mosquitoes without harming pollinators from the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website. And Ella mentions she has tiger mosquitoes in her yard. I do as well. And Ashley says that mosquitoes are very prevalent. She's been bitten on several occasions this summer when she's done outside activities, which is quite annoying. So yes, probably all of us have had multiple experiences with the mosquitoes, if not also ticks. So another way to prepare for climate change impacted severe weather is to make a plan. And emergency plans force you to think about what you would do in emergency before it happens, sort of saving time when the disaster strikes. And it's important to talk to your family and loved ones about the risk in the community and discuss where you will meet and what you will do if a disaster happens. And so when you are making your plan, you want to think about 6 basics. And those basics are water, food, shelter, communication, medical care, and home safety. The average person needs about 1 gallon of water per day. And you need to plan to have food that does not need to be refrigerated and probably not heated as well. You'll need to know how you're going to communicate with your family and loved ones once our communication systems go down, and make sure that your house is ready for a disaster and where you can go if it's no longer safe to stay at home. Having basic medical supplies is very important. And then you want to prepare for home safety by knowing where shut-off valves are for power, water, and gas. And then when the social order is disrupted, how will you protect your home? So making a kit is another important way to prepare for an emergency. You probably have some items already at home. But a disaster kit is simply a collection of items that you need during an emergency. Again, you want to try and make sure you have those ahead of time, because once that emergency happens, everybody's going to be scrambling for those supplies. And the other thing is, although emergency personnel will be out trying to help people, they may not be able to get you right away. So you want to have those supplies on hand in case you end up without help for a few days. And again, while you're making your kit and while you're making your plan, don't forget about your pets. You'll need supplies for them as well. And the library has emergency starter kits available that you can pick up. And these kits include handouts from the City of Alexandria's Office of Emergency Management. And they suggest items to include in your kit, as well as how to get basic information together when an emergency arises. And you may not be able to stay in home, shelter in place in certain emergencies. So you will need to put together a go bag, or some places call it a bug out bag. And this essentially is 3 days of supplies for each person in your household. And this is a long list that's on this slide, but essentially it breaks down into covering those 6 essentials that we mentioned before: water, food, communication, shelter, medical care, and safety. In addition to having your bag to go, you may want to think about a get home bag, because you may not be home when an emergency happens. You could be at work or out at the store, so you may consider keeping a bag either at work with you or in the car, just in case. So when an emergency arrives, right before the emergency happens is when you want to move into action. So you want to be paying attention to the early warning and weather apps to see what recommendations are being made, what to expect, how severe the weather is that is expected to come. And then you also want to start prepping your home. So you want to make sure, again, you have a water supply for at least 1 gallon to 2 gallons per person per day. And if you're caught unawares, there are sources of water in your home that are slightly unconventional. There's water in your hot water heater, your toilet tank, not the bowl, but the tank has water, ice in your freezer, and also in dire situations, liquid from canned foods. There are also gray water options. So this is water that you don't necessarily want to consume, but may use for other sources. So, you can fill tubs and sinks, or you have a tub or a pool, and again, rain barrels at your home. These will need to be boiled or purified before they can be used. And then again, you want to make sure you have food enough for 2 weeks. Keep your refrigerator closed, and if you think you're going to lose power, you might want to move important food to the freezer. It will help everything stay colder together. Remember, if anything is warmer than 40 degrees for more than 2 hours, or above 90 degrees for 1 hour, you shouldn't consume it. It could make you sick. If you're staying in place, depending on whether it's winter or summer, you will want to make sure that you're staying either warm or cool. So you pick a room in the house that will either address those needs, and then you want to think about keeping yourself cool or warm and not worrying so much about the room. If it's hot, you want to also make sure you're hydrated. If it's cold at that time, you want to make sure you're dressing in layers. And then also you want to go over with your family the plan. How will you communicate? Who will you contact? How will you leave if you need to? You want to make sure that everyone is familiar with that and has copies if they need it. And then again, you'll also want to find out if you need to turn off the power or gas in your home. You want to make sure you know where your important documents are and that you have proof of what you own. Back up your photos to the cloud. And then also don't forget about your neighbors. There may be people close to you who don't have family or are sick or have not as many resources. So you want to make sure that they, you know that they are going to be safe as well. And unfortunately, time has just flown by. So I am going to jump ahead. Ellen also mentions when there are weather warnings, she puts about 2 inches of water in the tub for flushing toilets, because her toilets work by gravity. She also fills a water pitcher to have on hand when there may be a pause in water supplies. And I also put a few food items in a small beverage refrigerator if the power goes out and we don't want to open the family refrigerator. And Ashley mentions we're also a family that builds up a supply of fresh water, similar to what Ellen does. They use refillable jugs, and they have a little generator that they use electricity if they need it. And then they eat a lot of non-perishable foods when the lights are out, like peanut butter, or non-perishable, I think, sorry, like peanut butter and crackers and granola bars. These are all great suggestions. So I am, give me just a second. So you all have shared some great ideas. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I don't want to keep you. And I will share some more resources so that if you are interested in finding out specific to certain kinds of disasters of what you can do. But I wanted to give some time for you to, as some of you already have, but if there's any other ideas that you have for suggestions that would help people prepare, because we know that people have lots of great knowledge, and I want to make sure that we are pulling from that. So feel free if you have other ideas that are helpful in emergency situations or things we haven't talked about, to put those in the chat. Or yeah, I guess just the chat, because it won't let you unmute, unfortunately. While we're waiting for those to come in, I am going to just suggest, since I have mentioned a few times the importance of being a good neighbor in these kinds of crisis, the city offers something called a CERT training, which stands for Community Emergency Response Team. And this is a several-week program that trains citizens to help in emergency situations. It's voluntary, and they allow you to help at your comfort level. And I feel like this would be another great way, if you are interested in learning more about emergency preparedness, to learn about that and how you can help yourself and your family and your community. The trainings usually happen in the fall and in the spring. I believe the fall is already on its way, but typically there will be a spring training as well. And then last thing I wanted to share with you is, if you are interested in learning more, these are a lot of the resources I pulled from to put this program together. The 4th National Climate Assessment is a very, it's not a cheery read, but it's important. And then there's also the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Both of these will explain a lot of what to look at, what it will look like in the Southeast as climate changes are occurring. Ready.gov is a government site that helps you prepare for emergencies. It has it by general preparation, what to have on hand, down to specific types of hazards that can occur and how to respond to each of those. It's a great resource that's recommended by the Office of Emergency Management as well. And then a book that has just come out this year that does not sound fun, but it actually is pretty entertaining, if you can believe that, is How to Prepare for Climate Change, A Practical Guide to Surviving the Chaos by David Pogge. Lots of good information in there. If you're looking for a very practical how-to, step-by-step, we have a book called In Case of Emergency, a family disaster planning book by Allison Stewart. And this has essentially making lists to get ready for all kinds of disasters. And then finally, this spring, we had a number of excellent webinars that are all recorded and available from the library's website YouTube page under the sustainability series that address a lot of these ideas in more details. The first one that comes to mind is emergency and extreme weather preparedness. That was led by Brent Ruggles, who works for the Office of Emergency Management. Jessica Lassiter held a program, Climate Change Adaptation, which talked about specifically preparing your home for flooding, and also what the city is doing to help mitigate some of these flooding issues in the city. Sustainability in Alexandria, again, as I mentioned, preparing for climate change disasters and also making your home sustainable have a lot of things in common. So you may want to check out Sustainability in Alexandria. And then finally, we had an author, and the name of the webinar is Climate Change Near You, who wrote about what climate change will look like in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, sort of in this region, and his experiences as he did research in the area. And Elaine mentions, this doesn't help with an emergency situation, but I prepared a public ed presentation and written a series of articles about how climate change affects gardening. I will be posting a checklist of mitigation and adaptations of climate conscious gardening practices. And these, again, will be on the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia. So yeah, thank you, Elaine, for sharing that. Master Gardeners is such a wonderful resource. So thank you all so much for participating in this discussion. Again, there was so much more I wanted to share with you all, but as you can see, time flew by. So if you're interested in more resources to the Alexandria Library, I invite you to check out alexlibraryva.org sustainability. And then if you're interested about what climate or crew communities responding to extreme weather offers, you can check out their website. They've actually had a whole week of incredible programs specific to climate prep as well. And those are open to anyone who's interested in participating. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them and I will try to answer them. Otherwise, I just want to say thanks so much for being here this evening.